There is a moment in every person's life when they realize something so devastating that they can never be the same again. An instant when the veil falls, and you finally see the invisible chains that were always there, controlling every movement, every thought, every decision you believed was yours. Michel Foucault dedicated his entire life to studying this moment, the day when the submissive awakens and realizes that their obedience was never a choice, but a meticulously architected construction. And what he discovered is so disturbing that it forever changed how we understand power, freedom, and control. Foucault documented something that most people spend their entire lives without noticing. You are not controlled by brute force or direct threats. You are controlled by something much more sophisticated, something that makes you police yourself, judge yourself, limit yourself, all while believing you are making free choices. He called this disciplinary power, and it is everywhere. In the school where you learn to raise your hand before speaking, in the workplace where you internalize schedules and expectations, in the way you behave in public, even when no one is watching. But here is the part that truly terrified Foucault. The system no longer needs to constantly watch you. You have learned to watch yourself. You have become your own jailer. And the day you realize this is the day something inside you either breaks or awakens. Think about how many times today you adjusted your behavior not because someone told you to do so, but because you internalized a rule, an expectation, a standard. How many times did you censor yourself, limit your words, control your expressions, modify your desires, all without anyone needing to be present to force you? Foucault realized that this is the most efficient type of control. Not the kind that comes from outside with weapons and prisons, but the kind you carry within yourself, operating automatically, invisibly, constantly. He studied institutions, prisons, psychiatric hospitals, schools, and found the same pattern everywhere. Systems designed not just to punish unwanted behaviors, but to produce people who no longer need to be punished because they have already learned to behave exactly as the system wants. And the genius, the truly diabolical part of this mechanism, is that you believe you are doing it of your own free will. You think it is your decision to be productive, to be well-behaved, to be normal. But Foucault would ask you a devastating question. Where did these ideas about what is productive, well-behaved, or normal come from? Are they really yours, or were they planted in you so early, so deeply, that you never questioned their origin? Foucault's discovery about power did not begin in a classroom or in a philosophy book. It began when he himself went through psychiatric institutions, when he saw firsthand how the system treated those it considered deviant, mad, abnormal. He saw people being broken, not by physical torture, but by something much more insidious, by diagnoses, by classifications, by treatments that claimed to be helping, but were actually normalizing. Foucault realized that these institutions did not just exist to cure or correct, they existed to define, to draw the line between the acceptable and the unacceptable, between the sane and the mad, between the productive and the unproductive. And once you are classified on the wrong side of that line, the system has complete permission to mold you, modify you, adjust you until you fit into the approved categories. This led him to a terrifying revelation. All of modern society works this way, not just hospitals and prisons, everything. From the school that teaches children to sit in rows, quiet, obedient, to the workplace that measures your productivity every second, to social media that teaches you to present an approved version of yourself. All these systems are training you, molding you, disciplining you. And the most brilliant part, you do not even notice it is happening. You think it is just normal life. Foucault wrote about the panopticon, a prison idealized by philosopher Jeremy Bentham, where prisoners could be observed at any time, but never knew when they were being watched. The genius of the design was that prisoners uncertain about when they were being observed, began to behave as if they were always being watched. They internalized the watcher's gaze. They became their own guards. And then Foucault asked the question that changed everything. Are we not all living in a giant panopticon? How many cameras exist in your city? How many algorithms track your online behavior? How many times do you adjust what you say or do because you know or imagine that someone might be paying attention? You have already internalized the watcher. You have already become your own jailer. And the prison no longer even needs walls because you carry the bars within yourself. This is Foucault's most dangerous discovery. Modern power does not work by telling you what not to do. It works by telling you who to be. It does not prohibit you. It produces you, and you become exactly what it needs you to be, a docile, productive, self-regulated subject who never needs to be forced because you have already learned to force yourself. Now here is where Foucault's discovery becomes really disturbing. He realized that there is no grand conspirator behind all of this. There is no single villain who designed this control system. Power, as Foucault discovered, is not located in a single place. It is spread, diffuse, present in every interaction, in every institution, in every small rule and expectation. Power is not something someone possesses. It is something that circulates, that operates through all of us. You're not just a victim of the system. You're also part of it. Every time you judge someone for not fitting in, every time you reinforce a social norm, every time you tell someone how they should behave, you are perpetuating the same control mechanism that controls you. This is Foucault's most devastating insight. We cannot simply overthrow power because it is not in a single place to be overthrown. It is everywhere. It is in us, and the awakening, the true awakening, is not realizing who controls you. It is realizing how you control yourself and others, often without even noticing. Foucault studied the history of sexuality, of madness, of punishment, and found the same pattern everywhere. He saw how society creates categories, normal and abnormal, sane and mad, heterosexual and homosexual, productive and unproductive, and then uses these categories to control people, not through brute force, but through something much more subtle, through shame, exclusion, pathologization. If you do not fit into the approved categories, you are not punished directly. You are diagnosed, treated, corrected. And the most insidious thing is that this is done in the name of your own good. Institutions say they are helping you, curing you, making you better, but what they are really doing is forcing you to conform. Foucault saw this happen to people who loved differently, thought differently, lived differently. They were labeled as sick, deviant, dangerous, and then the system had permission to intervene, to modify, to normalize. He documented how homosexuality was treated as mental illness until recently, how gender non-conformity is still pathologized, how any form of being that challenges established norms is immediately marked as something that needs to be corrected. And here is the question Foucault would ask you. How many parts of you have been normalized? How many desires have you suppressed? Not because they were wrong, but because they did not fit what was considered acceptable. How many times have you modified yourself, adjusted yourself, censored yourself, not by genuine choice, but because you internalized the system's expectation? Foucault realized that most people never ask themselves these questions. They simply accept that certain things are normal and others are not. They accept that there is a right way to live, to love, to work, to be, and they spend their entire lives trying to fit into these categories without ever questioning who created them, why they exist, or whom they serve. But on the day you start asking these questions, on the day you awaken to the fact that everything you considered natural and inevitable is actually constructed and contingent, something changes irreversibly. You can no longer return to unconscious obedience. You have seen the chains, and now you need to decide what to do with this knowledge. The most controversial part of Foucault's work was when he began questioning the very categories that society uses to define sanity, normality, and health. He was not just saying that the control system was bad. He was saying that even the concepts we use to understand ourselves identity, sexuality, reason, madness, are products of power. They do not exist independently of the system that defines them. This means that when you say, "I am this" or "I am that," you are not simply describing a pre-existing truth about yourself. You are using categories that were created by systems of power that serve specific purposes, often of control and normalization. Foucault was not saying that you do not exist or that your experiences are not real. He was saying that the way you understand and articulate these experiences is shaped by discourses of power, and these discourses change over time. What was considered madness in one era is normality in another. What was crime in one place is virtue in another, and this reveals something fundamental. The categories we use to understand ourselves are not eternal or natural. They are historical, constructed, contingent, and they can be deconstructed and reconstructed. Foucault offered us a concept to think about this. He called it archaeology of knowledge. The idea that we can excavate the layers of discourse and power to understand how certain knowledges, certain truths, certain forms of being were constructed and legitimized. When you do this archaeology, when you excavate, you discover that nothing is as solid as it seems. The truths you accepted as absolute are actually recent. The norms you thought were universal are actually local. The identities you considered fixed are actually fluid, and this awakening is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating, because you realize that if everything is constructed, everything can be deconstructed and reconstructed differently. Terrifying, because you lose the comfort of certainties, of stable categories, of unquestionable truths. You find yourself in a world where nothing is guaranteed, where everything is open to contestation, where you constantly need to negotiate who you are in relation to the systems of power that surround you. But here is the paradox Foucault faced. If all knowledge is a product of power, if all truth is constructed, then his own work, his theories, his analyses are also products of power. They are also constructions, and this means there is no external position to power from which you can make pure critique. You are always within the system. Your resistances, your transgressions, your attempts at freedom, all of them happen within structures of power. Foucault did not see this as defeat. He saw it as the human condition. Power is not something you can simply escape, but you can resist it, you can challenge it, you can create gaps, fissures, breaking points. And it is in these moments of resistance, however small or temporary they may be, that something new can emerge. Not absolute freedom, because it does not exist, but new forms of being, new possibilities, new configurations of power that might be a little less oppressive, a little more open, a little more just. Foucault spent the last years of his life exploring what he called practices of the self, ways in which individuals can work on themselves, can transform themselves, can relate to systems of power more consciously and strategically. He looked at the ancient Greeks and Romans and saw that they had an entire ethics of care of the self, techniques to shape one's own character, to cultivate virtues, to become the kind of person one wants to be. And Foucault wondered, could we recover something of this? Could we develop our own practices of the self for the modern era? Not simply obeying the norms imposed on us, but consciously choosing how we want to live, what kind of person we want to be, what relationships we want to cultivate. This is not freedom in the absolute sense. It is something more modest and more realistic. It is the practice of making your own life a work of art, of sculpting yourself with consciousness, with intention, with care, knowing that you are always working with materials you did not completely choose, within limitations you cannot simply transcend, but still finding spaces for agency, for creativity, for resistance. The day the submissive awakens is not a single event. It is an ongoing process. It is realizing each day the small ways in which you self-police, the expectations you have internalized, the judgments you make automatically, the norms you reinforce without thinking, and then, little by little, beginning to question these things, not necessarily in a dramatic way, not with grand gestures of rebellion, but with small practices of freedom, small refusal, small transgression. Every time you do something that goes off the expected script, every time you challenge a norm you have always accepted, every time you choose to live in a way that does not fit perfectly into the approved categories, you are practicing resistance. You are creating fissures in the system, and these fissures, however small they may be, are important because it is through them that new possibilities emerge. Foucault knew that awakening has a cost. When you begin to see power everywhere, when you begin to question the norms everyone accepts, when you begin to live in a way that challenges expectations, you face resistance. People around you may see you as strange, difficult, problematic, because you are no longer playing the game the expected way. You are no longer confirming the shared illusions that keep the social order functioning smoothly, and this makes you a type of threat. Not a violent threat, but an existential threat. You represent the possibility that things could be different. And for many people, especially those invested in the current system, this possibility is deeply disturbing. Foucault lived this in his own life. As a gay man in an era when homosexuality was pathologized, as an intellectual who challenged academic orthodoxies, as an activist who questioned the prison system and other institutions, he knew the cost of non-conformity. But he also knew the cost of conformity, the cost of living a life that is not really yours, the cost of spending your entire existence trying to fit into categories that were never made for you, the cost of carrying invisible chains and pretending they do not exist. The question Foucault leaves us is not whether we should obey or rebel. It is much more subtle and more difficult than that. The question is, how can we live consciously within systems of power that we cannot simply abandon, but also do not want to simply accept? How can we cultivate practices of freedom in a world where absolute freedom is impossible? How can we create small spaces of resistance, small zones of autonomy, small moments of authenticity amid all the forces pushing us toward conformity? Foucault did not offer easy answers. He did not have a revolutionary program. He did not promise that following his ideas would lead to some paradise of freedom. He was much more modest and much more realistic than that. What he offered was a tool for diagnosis, a way to see power where before you only saw naturalness, a way to question what before you just accepted. And once you see, once you question, you can no longer return to unconscious obedience. You have awakened, and now you have to figure out how to live with this awakening. For some people, awakening leads to active militancy. They dedicate themselves to challenging systems of power, to fighting for change, to creating alternatives. For others, it leads to a quieter form of resistance. Small everyday practices of non-conformity, small refusals to participate in certain rituals of normalization, small affirmations of forms of being that do not fit perfectly into approved molds. And for some people, awakening leads to what Foucault called care of the self, a commitment to work on oneself, to cultivate practices that allow living more consciously, more intentionally, more freely within limitations that cannot be completely overcome. None of these responses is better than the others. There is no right way to awaken. Each person needs to find their own path through the structures of power that surround them. But what all these responses have in common is the refusal to simply accept, the refusal to live completely unconsciously, the refusal to be just another docile body that the system produces and manages without resistance. Foucault's most radical discovery may be this: power is not inherently evil. It is inevitable. Wherever there are human relations, there will be relations of power. The question is not to eliminate power, which would be impossible. The question is, what kind of power relations do we want to cultivate? Do we want relations based on rigid domination, where some completely control others? Or do we want more fluid, more reversible relations, more open to negotiation? Do we want systems that produce conformity through constant surveillance and normalization? Or do we want systems that allow more space for difference, for experimentation, for forms of life that do not fit into established categories? These questions have no definitive answers. They need to be remade constantly, in each context, in each historical moment. But what Foucault's work gives us is the ability to ask these questions consciously, to not simply accept current power configurations as natural, inevitable, or desirable, to always be attentive to the ways in which power operates, including the ways it operates through ourselves. The day the submissive awakens is the day you realize there is no outside of power. You cannot simply exit the system and live in pure freedom, but you can begin to move within the system with more consciousness, with more strategy, with more capacity to create small points of resistance and transformation. You can begin to make your life not just a passive reproduction of norms that were imposed on you, but an active practice of freedom. Limited, yes. Partial, yes. Always negotiating with structures of power you do not completely control, yes. But still yours, still chosen, still conscious. And this consciousness by itself is already a form of resistance, because disciplinary power works best when it is invisible, when you do not realize you are being molded, when you think you are just being yourself naturally. The moment you see power, the moment you recognize the mechanisms of normalization, the moment you realize that much of what you considered natural is actually constructed, you become less docile, less predictable, less controllable. Foucault died in 1984, victim of complications related to AIDS, at a time when the disease was highly stigmatized and poorly understood. Until the end, he was exploring questions of power, control, and resistance. Until the end, he was trying to live his life as a practice of freedom, refusing to completely conform to expectations, experimenting with new forms of being and relating. And his legacy is not a set of ready-made answers, it is a set of tools for analysis. It is a way of looking at the world that allows us to see what was previously invisible. It is an invitation to awaken, to perceive the chains, and then consciously decide what to do with this knowledge. You do not need to become a revolutionary. You do not need to overthrow entire systems. But you can start today with small practices, noticing when you are self-policing, questioning where the norms you follow automatically come from, creating small spaces of experimentation where you can be a little different, a little more you, a little less what the system expects. The day the submissive awakens is not the day you become completely free. It is the day you begin the practice of freedom. And this practice, this conscious journey through structures of power, is a lifelong work. It has no end. It has no final destination, but it has dignity. It has authenticity. It has the satisfaction of knowing that you are living consciously, that you are making choices, even if limited, that you are creating your life instead of just passively accepting it. Foucault offered us the diagnosis. He showed us how power operates, how we are disciplined, how we become our own jailers. And he invited us to use this knowledge not for despair, but for practice, to begin, little by little, to live differently. The question he leaves us is simple but profound. Now that you know how it works, what are you going to do? Will you go back to sleep, pretend you did not see, continue unconscious obedience? Or will you fully awaken and begin the difficult but dignified journey of living consciously within and against the systems of power that surround you? Before I finish, let me extend an invitation. If you made it this far, if something in this video resonated with you, if you felt that restlessness that comes with awakening, then you are not alone. There are others who have also seen the chains, others who are also practicing freedom in their own lives. And it is important that we find each other, that we share our experiences, that we support each other on this journey. So, leave in the comments your reflections. How do you see power operating in your own life? Where have you internalized the watcher? What small practices of resistance are you cultivating? Let us create here a space for dialogue, for exchange, for mutual recognition. And if you want to continue exploring these ideas, these tools, for seeing power and practicing freedom, subscribe to the channel, because I will continue bringing thinkers, ideas, and perspectives that help us live more consciously, more authentically, more freely, within the limitations we all face. Together, we can create small zones of awakening, small communities of resistance, small practices of freedom that added together can make a difference. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.